Okay, so as mentioned in the last video here, a little bit about this CO2, which is this major greenhouse gas as it relates to the Earth. So remembering again that CO2 is like a blanket for IR. Just like you might wrap yourself in a blanket or cover yourself in a blanket when you sleep at night to stay warm. Well, that's exactly what CO2 and greenhouse gases do for a planet. So this is a very famous plot here that I wanted to show you here. That is the carbon dioxide so-called concentration on Earth. So the first thing to highlight here is what are the units of the graph. Well, this is the year down here. So you can see the 2000s are up here all the way down to 0. So roughly something like 2,000 years of history. And of course, well, how do they go so far back, 2,000 years of history, to get these CO2 concentrations? Well, they can dig them out of ice samples, say in the North or South Pole, because as the ice, as it snows there, it just sort of covers every year. There's layer after layer after layer. If they dig really far down, there's little air bubbles trapped in the ice that preserve what the CO2 concentration must have been at that point in time. So that's the year, okay? And of course over here, this is CO2, and ppm stands for parts per million. So what that means, if you had 1 million, say, gas molecules, how many of them would be a CO2? So if it says something like 300, that means 300 CO2 molecules exist in an otherwise big sea of 1 million other gas molecules. That's sort of what the concentration means. And so this is a very famous graph. You've probably seen it before, maybe in your high school, elementary school, when talking about global warming and climate crisis and all these sorts of things. But what you can see is that for a really, really long time, maybe something like 1,600 years, the CO2 concentration was pretty stable at 280 parts per million. That was just some equilibrium that the Earth reached. Then, of course, right around here, right around the 1800s, early 1900s, it starts to go up. And can you think of what was happening right about here in time? Sort of think a bit, I don't know, 1900s or so, late 1800s. Well, that's the Industrial Revolution. So factories, cars, machines, that all sort of involved fossil fuels, discovering oil, burning coal, all that sort of thing. That's sort of when it started there. And of course, during that time, and it looks like since then, the carbon dioxide concentration has just risen like crazy until the 2000s. Even today, this graph needs to be updated. But currently, as we're sort of making this video here in the year 2020, the CO2 concentration on Earth now is about 400 parts per million, and even exceeding that a little bit. That's the new stable value for carbon dioxide. So it's no longer 280, no longer even 300, 340. It's now something like 400 parts per million. And I hope you can kind of remember this number, or just sort of put it in your mind, because this is what comes up in the news quite a bit. When talking about carbon dioxide and global warming things, that number always comes up, and that's what it means. So at the moment then, every 1 million gas, say, molecules in the atmosphere, about 400 of them are carbon dioxide. And as we know, carbon dioxide is this warming element, right? So we're sort of covering the Earth with more and more and more carbon dioxide. And here's sort of a more zoomed in graph of the same thing since 1960 or so. So this is very dramatic over here, seeing it sort of flat and then going up over 2,000 years. Okay, you don't believe that about the ice samples and being able to sample that far back. That's fine. But here are some samples taken with modern day technology, more or less from 1960s to today. So see, it is indeed going up. And these little wiggles you see are just seasonal variations in carbon dioxide. And by seasonal, I literally mean fall, winter, spring, and summer, that kind of thing. There's some variations, but you see the trend is definitely upwards, as we continue to burn fossil fuels and the cows and all that sort of thing. And so what I want you to do, then I'll just wrap this up. This is all just a bit of something just that you can just think about then as the CO2 goes up. One of the questions that always happens is, can Earth become a Venus? And by that I mean, as we keep pumping carbon dioxide into our atmosphere with some of the industrial process that we do, will the greenhouse effect sort of get out of control and keep warming the Earth? And will the same thing happen on Earth that happened on Venus? Because you have to think then, what happens is we get warmer. Well, in particular, ice melts. And what that's going to do is that puts more of this water, H2O, in the atmosphere, which is another greenhouse gas. If we start melting ice and start melting more water, there's more greenhouse gases, the temperature gets warmer. As the temperature gets warmer, it melts more ice, more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that kind of thing. So that's exactly what we're kind of worried about, but that's sort of the astronomer's question is Venus is a good example of what can happen if you don't watch your carbon dioxide budget. And I'm not saying there was a civilization there that was driving around and burning fossil fuels the way we are, but however Venus got into its state, it's this hot inferno because of the CO2 blanket around it, and we are making that blanket thicker and thicker for ourselves here on Earth. So it's just something to think about. So what I'd like you to do then is Albert Gore, one of the former vice presidents of the United States under Bill Clinton, made sort of a very famous video a while back called An Inconvenient Truth, and I'd like you just to watch the clip on the CO2 concentration that he produced. So take a look at this clip.
Is now gone. There is a message in this. It is worldwide. And the ice has stories to tell us. My friend Lonnie Thompson digs core drills in the ice. They dig down and they bring the core drills back up and they look at the ice and they study it. When the snow falls, it traps little bubbles of atmosphere, and they can go in and measure how much CO2 was in the atmosphere the year that snow fell. What's even more interesting, I think, is they can measure the different isotopes of oxygen and figure out a very precise thermometer and tell you what the temperature was the year that bubble was trapped in the snow as it fell. When I was in Antarctica, I saw cores like this, and a guy looked at it. He said, right here is where the U.S. Congress passed the Clean Air Act. And I couldn't believe it, but you can see the difference with the naked eye. Just a couple of years after that law was passed, it's very clearly distinguishable. They can count back year by year the same way a forester reads tree rings, and you can see each annual layer from the melting and refreezing. So they can go back in a lot of these mountain glaciers 1,000 years. And they constructed a thermometer of the temperature. The blue is cold and the red is warm. Now, I show this for a couple of reasons. Number one, the so-called skeptics will sometimes say, oh, this whole thing, this is a cyclical phenomenon. There was a medieval warming period after all. Well, yeah, there was. There it is right there. There are two others. But compared to what's going on now, there's just no comparison. So if you look at 1,000 years worth of temperature and compare it to 1,000 years of CO2, you can see how closely they fit together. Now, 1,000 years of CO2 in the mountain glaciers, that's one thing. But in Antarctica, they can go back 650,000 years. This, incidentally, is the first time anybody outside of a small group of scientists has seen this image. This is the present day era, and that's the last ice age. Then it goes up. We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. That's the period of warming between the last two ice ages. That's the second and third ice age back, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh ice age back. Now, an important point. In all of this time, 650,000 years, the CO2 level has never gone above 300 parts per million. Now, as I said, they can also measure temperature. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside. In the parts of the United States that contain the modern cities of Cleveland, Detroit, New York, in the northern tier, this is the difference between a nice day and having a mile of ice over your head. Keep that in mind when you look at this fact. Carbon dioxide having never gone above 300 parts per million, here is where CO2 is now. Way above where it's ever been as far back as this record will measure. Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point. The crew here has tried to teach me how to use this contraption here, so if I don't kill myself, I'll... It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. You've heard of off the charts. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here. There's not a single fact or date or number that's been used to make this up that's in any controversy. The so-called skeptics look at this and they say, so? That seems perfectly okay. Well, again, if on the temperature side, if this much on the cold side is a mile of ice over our heads, what would that much on the warm side be? Ultimately, this is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue. If we allow that to happen, it is deeply unethical.